The steam hung low in the narrow laundry room, turning every breath warm and heavy as a young mess attendant folded a stack of white uniforms in the quiet dawn. The ship beneath him, the USS West Virginia, moved with its usual steady rhythm, nothing to hint that history was about to break open above his head. He was just a cook, a mess attendant, assigned to carry coffee scrub quarters and disappear into the background. No weapons, no battle station with a gun. That was the rule for black sailors in the US Navy in 1941. But rules do not matter when steel tears, when a blast rips the world apart. At 7:55 a.m., the first explosion hit. The lights flickered, the deck rolled, and the man who would later be known as Doris Miller, an African-American war hero no one expected, looked up into a storm of noise and fire. Above him, aircraft were diving into the harbor. Below him, water was rushing through the torn hull. Somewhere in that chaos, on a morning soon to be forever linked to Pearl Harbor, he made a decision that changed the US Navy. How does a cook become a symbol of courage? And what did it cost him and the nation to discover who he truly was? Before the world knew his name, Doris Miller was simply a young man from Waco, Texas, trying to support his family. The Navy offered steady pay, and in 1939, that was enough. But for black sailors in the US Navy, the path was already chosen before they even stepped aboard a ship. They were assigned to the mess cooking, cleaning serving officers, and staying far from anything that resembled combat. Regulations made it clear they would not handle weapons, they would not train for battle, and they would never stand behind the guns that defined naval power. That was the world Miller walked into. When he reported to the USS West Virginia, he learned the ship the way only a mess attendant could. He knew whose uniforms needed extra starch, which officers preferred early coffee, which compartments stayed warm on winter nights. He memorized laundry cycles, meal schedules, and quiet routines. None of it felt heroic. None of it suggested the making of an African-American war hero. But routine has a way of sharpening a man's awareness. Miller knew every deck, every ladder well, every turn of the passageways. He knew how the ship breathed. And on the morning of December 7th, 1941, that familiarity became his first compass in chaos. The sun was just beginning to spill over the harbor as he prepared for another Sunday of laundry work. Outside Pearl Harbor was calm, a postcard of still water and anchored battleships. Inside the USS West Virginia, the smell of soap and steam drifted through the lower decks. It was a morning built on predictability, the kind of morning that makes disaster feel impossible. Then came the first shock. A torpedo slammed into the port side, hurling Miller against the bulkhead. The room shuddered, lights died and came back dim red, casting long shadows that danced with every explosion above. He heard running footsteps, shouted orders, and the unmistakable sound of water forcing its way through steel. When he rushed toward his assigned battle station, he found nothing but twisted metal and a gaping hole where the compartment had been. Water crashed through the opening, pouring into the ship as sunlight flickered across the surface of the flood. The USS West Virginia was already wounded, already listing. Smoke drifted down the passageways. Alarms shrieked through the decks like a warning no one had the time to interpret. Miller stood for a breath, just one absorbing the impossible reality that his station no longer existed. But men were still fighting to seal hatches. Others were dragging the wounded from the lower decks. The ship needed hands, any hands, and in that moment, no one cared whether those hands belonged to a mess attendant. Then an officer grabbed him. The captain was wounded on the bridge. They needed help now. Miller sprinted up ladders slick with oil and seawater, emerging into a world he barely recognized. Smoke smeared the sky. Flames rose from ships across Battleship Row. The air stung with burning oil. Aircraft were diving toward the harbor in a swarm. And somewhere above the roar of the attack, Doris Miller heard the call that would carry him from anonymity toward history. When Doris Miller reached the upper decks, the world had turned into a storm of metal and fire. Japanese dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their engines cutting through the smoke like a blade. Torpedo planes skimmed across the harbor, their wakes carved into the oil-coated water. From every direction came the sharp crack of gunfire, the deep rumble of explosions, and the desperate shouts of sailors fighting to keep their ship alive. This was Pearl Harbor, at its breaking point. An officer pointed Miller toward the bridge. There, Captain Mervyn Bennion lay collapsed on the deck, his uniform torn open by shrapnel that had crossed from the nearby Tennessee. The wound was mortal, terribly clear to anyone who saw it. Yet the captain refused to be moved. Propped against the railing, his face pale and determined, he continued issuing orders to save the USS West Virginia from capsizing. Miller helped steady him, shielding him from falling debris, witnessing a kind of courage that lives only in the hardest moments of war. But the ship needed more than one act of courage. A call rang out for men to support the anti-aircraft batteries on the port side. Miller ran toward the guns, his legs shaking from the explosions racking the deck beneath him. When he arrived, he saw the crew slumped around their mount, killed where they stood by strafing fire. The weapon remained cold-loaded and waiting. It was a Browning, .50 caliber machine gun, the kind Miller had watched 100 times during drills. But no regulation allowed a mess attendant, especially one of the black sailors in the US Navy, to touch it. Regulations did not matter anymore. With aircraft diving and torpedoes cutting across the harbor, Miller wrapped his hands around the gun's grips. The metal felt hot, the vibration alive beneath his fingertips. He squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber roared to life, hammering against his shoulders with every burst. Tracer rounds arced into the sky, thin red lines threading through smoke and chaos. He aimed where the planes would be, not where they were trusting instinct or where training had never been given. A Val dive bomber climbed away after releasing its payload. Miller tracked it, holding the trigger steady as sparks flickered along the fuselage. Another target streaked low across the water, a Kate torpedo bomber racing toward Battleship Row. Miller swung the Browning, leading the aircraft just enough for the rounds to bite into its wing. A chunk of metal tore free, spiraling into the harbor. The bomber wavered but pressed on. The fight was a blur, 15 minutes of recoil smoke and the relentless discipline of survival. Around him, the USS West Virginia groaned under the impact of more torpedoes, yet he remained at the gun until the ammunition ran dry. Only then did an officer order him to stop. Miller stepped back, ears ringing, his arms trembling from the recoil. He had done what he could, more than anyone expected, more than the Navy ever imagined a cook could do. But he wasn't finished. With the attack still raging, he helped drag wounded sailors across the burning deck, guiding them through smoke-filled passageways toward any path that remained. Even as the ship settled lower into the harbor, Doris Miller kept working, driven by the same quiet determination that had guided him long before the world saw him as an African-American war hero. In those final minutes, as flames rose higher and the harbor churned with wreckage, he was no longer just a mess attendant caught in the chaos of Pearl Harbor. He was a man who chose action when everything around him was falling apart. When the smoke finally thinned over Pearl Harbor, the USS West Virginia lay half-submerged fires, hissing across her decks. Survivors were scattered across the harbor, clinging to debris, or waiting in silence as rescue boats moved between patches of burning oil. Doris Miller made it to safety with burns on his hands, deafened by hours of explosions, but alive. No one asked him what he had done. For the moment, the Navy cared only about counting the dead and preparing for war. In the early reports, officers noted that unidentified sailors had manned guns during the attack. Their names were missing, their actions blurred. And for black sailors in the US Navy, anonymity was expected. They were not supposed to fight. They were not supposed to challenge the structure that kept them in kitchens and laundry rooms. But sailors talk, and stories move faster than official paperwork. Soon other survivors began to whisper about a mess attendant who had manned a .50 caliber gun and fired back at the enemy for 15 minutes. By January 1942, the whispers reached the black press. The Pittsburgh Courier launched an investigation demanding to know the identity of the man who had fought back. Why had the Navy not named him? Why did the reports still describe him as unknown? Their questions spread across the country, joined by the NAACP and civil rights leaders, who saw in this story a truth the Navy could no longer hide. Under rising pressure, the Navy finally confirmed the name Doris Miller. Overnight, a young cook from Texas became the most recognized African-American war hero of the early war. The decision that came next shaped the national conversation. On May 27, 1942, aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Chester Nimitz presented Miller with the Navy Cross, the first ever awarded to an African-American sailor. Photographs captured him, standing rigid in his dress whites, the medal bright against his uniform. The moment was historic, but also complicated. The honor recognized his bravery, yet nothing changed about his status. He remained a mess attendant. He still served food. He still slept in segregated quarters. The war, however, had no interest in symbolism. It needed ships, aircraft, and carriers to push across the Pacific. In 1943, Miller was assigned to the escort carrier USS Liscome Bay, a small but essential vessel supporting Operation Galvanic. The mission was part of America's first major offensive in the Central Pacific, a steady grinding march toward Japan. Miller worked as a cook, rising to cook third class, preparing meals for nearly 1,000 men aboard the ship. He was doing his duty as he always had. Before dawn on November 24, 1943, the USS Liscome Bay moved through the dark waters near Makin Atoll. Aircraft were being readied on the flight deck. Engines hummed in the pre-morning stillness. Then, at 5:13 a.m., a lookout shouted a warning, a torpedo wake racing across the starboard side. The impact arrived a heartbeat later. The explosion tore into the carrier and ignited the bomb magazine. A second blast ripped upward, splitting the ship and filling the sky with fire. Men were vaporized where they stood. Aircraft were thrown into the air like toys. Flames, metal, and fuel rained across the water. In 23 minutes, the USS Liscome Bay rolled to starboard and disappeared beneath the sea. Of the 916 crew, 642 were lost. Doris Miller was among them. His body was never recovered. 2 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, his parents received the telegram that confirmed their worst fear. The nation had gained a hero. His family had lost a son. In the months and years after his death, the story of Doris Miller traveled far beyond the wreck of the USS Liscome Bay. It became more than an account of bravery under fire. It became a mirror the United States could not avoid. While the country fought a global war against fascism, it was forced to confront the contradiction at home. Millions were risking their lives for freedom. yet segregation still shaped the ranks of the military. The image of an African-American war hero manning a gun at Pearl Harbor, despite regulations designed to keep him unarmed, demanded an answer the nation had long postponed. Civil rights leaders understood this shift immediately. Newspapers highlighted the injustice of a system that celebrated Miller's courage while still denying opportunity to other black sailors in the US Navy. If a mess attendant could perform under fire with no training, what did that say about the Navy's insistence that black sailors were unfit for combat roles? That question was not rhetorical. It carried strategic weight. A military at war could not afford to sideline talent based on race, not when every ship, every gun crew, every set of capable hands mattered. Pressure mounted. By 1944, the Navy began opening general service ratings to African American recruits, allowing them to serve as gunners, radiomen, machinists, and quartermasters. These changes were incremental, sometimes resisted, and often inconsistent. But they were real, and they were rooted in a truth. The nation now recognized combat had exposed the cost of segregation, not only moral, but operational. The Pacific War required skill, discipline, and courage. Doris Miller had demonstrated all three. Globally, the world watched as the United States attempted to reconcile its ideals with its practices. Allies admired the bravery displayed at Pearl Harbor, yet the contradiction between American rhetoric and American segregation was impossible to ignore. That confrontation reached a turning point in 1948, when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 mandating equality of treatment in the armed forces. The order did not end discrimination overnight, but it established a foundation on which future generations would build. And woven into that foundation was the legacy of a young cook from Waco, Texas. In the end, Miller's story forced the United States to see itself more clearly. His courage strengthened the Navy. His sacrifice strengthened the nation. When we look back at that morning inside the laundry room of the USS West Virginia, it is easy to forget how ordinary it all seemed. A young mess attendant folding uniforms, a quiet ship on a calm harbor. Nothing to suggest that history was about to reshuffle the course of a life and the course of a nation. Yet, from that quiet moment emerged Doris Miller, a man who stepped beyond the boundaries laid out for him and into a fire no one believed he was allowed to face. His story carried across time because it refused to stay small. From the flames of Pearl Harbor, where a cook manned a .50 caliber gun and fought back without training, to the deck of the USS Liscome Bay, where he met his end in a flash of fire, Miller's path became one of the defining arcs of World War II. And long after the smoke cleared, long after the war ended, the nation continued to measure itself against the courage of a young man who simply did what needed to be done. He did not ask for recognition. He did not seek glory. But the country saw in him what it needed most, proof that heroism does not depend on rank, and that greatness can rise from any corner of a ship, even the laundry room. Today, the legacy of this African-American war hero stretches far beyond the headlines of the 1940s. It lives in the integration of the armed forces, in the opportunities now open to black sailors in the US Navy, and in the slow, painful progress toward equality that his actions helped set in motion. It lives in the monuments bearing his name in the servicemen and women who followed the path he helped clear, and in the future supercarrier that will sail into the Pacific with the name USS Doris Miller, symbol of what courage can change. History often asks us to remember the battles. Miller asks us to remember the choices. So as we close this chapter, we invite you to carry his story forward. Share what part of his journey resonates with you. Tell us what you believe is the greatest lesson we inherit from his life from Pearl Harbor to the deep waters where the USS Liscome Bay was lost. These stories endure because you keep them alive. If you value the lessons history leaves behind, consider subscribing to join us for the next chapter. The battle may be over, but the meaning continues to grow, and so does the legacy of Doris Miller,